I've been sitting on this story for 3 years, not because I didn't know how to tell it, because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. 1952, the US Air Defense Command runs a full war game. Soviet bombers attack North America. The conclusion. Classified for decades. We lose. That report lands on the desks of generals who already can't sleep. And that's where this story actually starts, not in a wind tunnel. In that moment, when the most powerful military on Earth stares at a piece of paper and has no answer. Hold one number in your head for the next 25 minutes, 15,000 meters. The cruising altitude of a 295 on a nuclear strike run. You can't see it. You can barely track it. And if just one gets through its release point, a city is gone. Not damaged, gone. Now multiply that by 600 million cubic kilometers of airspace that had to be defended, constantly. In real time, the Soviets had the same nightmare in reverse. NATO bases 30 minutes from their border. Same math, same dread. And here's what I find genuinely unsettling: two governments that hated each other enough to end civilization. With engineers who never once met, independently arrived at the exact same answer, the Delta Wing. The Convair F-106 Delta Dart, the Sukhoi Su-15 Flagon, same shape, same mission, built to intercept doomsday. But the philosophy behind each machine, what each superpower was willing to sacrifice, that's where things get interesting. That's what we're here for. After everything I just told you, the failed missiles, the wrong wars, the civilian tragedies, I want to step back and tell you a completely different kind of story. Because sometimes, in the middle of all the institutional failure and doctrine disasters, a machine does something so extraordinary that you almost forget everything else. February 2nd, 1970. Malmstrom Air Force Base. Montana Lieutenant Gary Faust is flying F-106A Delta Dart serial number 58787 in a training exercise. At 38,000 feet, about 11.5 kilometers up, during a hard maneuvering turn, the aircraft enters a flat spin. If you don't know what a flat spin is, it's essentially the aircraft equivalent of a death sentence. The plane is spinning horizontally around its vertical axis, nose pitched slightly up. All control surfaces completely stalled in turbulent airflow. Delta Wing aircraft are particularly vulnerable to this. Once you're in one, recovery is nearly impossible. Faust did everything the manual said. Rudder input, forward stick, throttle to idle, reset the trim. Nothing worked. The aircraft kept spinning at 15,000 feet. He made the only decision left. He pulled the ejection handle. And here, this is the moment I want you to really focus on, is where physics did something almost unbelievable. When Gary Faust ejected, the seat's rocket motor fired downward. That explosive force pushed the nose of the aircraft down. And simultaneously, losing 90 kilograms of pilot and seat shifted the center of gravity. The nose dropped. Air started flowing over the wings again. The spin broke, and the F-106, completely unpiloted, began flying. On its own, the takeoff trim setting that Faust had desperately configured during the spin, it was still active. The aircraft used it to level off. Then it began a slow, stable descent on its own, at 175 knots. The optimal glide speed, almost perfectly. From inside his parachute, Gary Faust watched his aircraft fly away from him. His flight leader, Major Jim Lowe, came over the radio with what I think is the best line in American aviation history. "Gary, you might want to get back in that thing." The F-106 drifted down through the Montana sky. It crossed a ridgeline. It descended over a snow-covered wheat field near Big Sandy. And then, cushioned by ground effect from that massive delta, Wing It landed on its belly in the snow. Gear up, no pilot, engine still running at idle. The local sheriff arrived at the scene to find canopy gone. No pilot, radar still scanning, and a Pratt & Whitney J-75 turning over quietly in the cold Montana air. The aircraft was repaired. The belly damage was minor. And F-106, a serial number 58787, the Cornfield Bomber flew for the United States Air Force for another 16 years. It's at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio right now. I've stood in front of that aircraft, and I genuinely felt something looking at it. Those engineers at Conveyor calculated the aerodynamics of their machine so precisely that it could save itself when the human being inside it gave up. That level of engineering confidence, that's extraordinary, and it makes what comes next all the more painful. Because at the exact moment these aircraft were achieving their aerodynamic perfection, the world they were built to defend was disappearing. Intercontinental ballistic missiles changed everything, not gradually, suddenly. An AIM doesn't fly through the atmosphere at 50,000 feet. It arcs through space. Its ray enters the atmosphere at 20 times the speed of sound. From launch to impact, 30 minutes. Anywhere on Earth. Mach 2.3 means nothing against Mach 20. The entire intellectual framework of the dedicated interceptor, the early warning. The radar tracking, the scramble, the intercept at altitude, it was all built around the assumption that threats would fly. And suddenly, the most dangerous threats were falling. You can't intercept a ballistic missile with an F-106. You can't intercept it with an Su-15. You can't intercept it with anything flying in the 1960s. And simultaneously, the real wars of that era, Vietnam, the Middle East, regional conflicts were teaching hard lessons about what fighters actually needed to do. Turn, maneuver, kill at close range, carry bombs, be flexible. The dedicated interceptor was dead. Born from one specific fear, killed by two simultaneous realities. A threat it couldn't reach, and wars it couldn't fight. The F-15 Eagle, the F-16, the Su-15 Flagon. These were the aircraft the world actually needed multi-role. Agile, with guns and long-range missiles both, with powerful autonomous radars that didn't need a ground controller to function. The era of the specialist was over. There's a dark irony that runs through the history of specialized weapons. The more precisely a weapon is built for one specific scenario, the more catastrophically it fails when asked to do anything else. The F-102 Delta Dagger and the Su-15 Flagon were both designed for one mission: climb to altitude, intercept a nuclear bomber, prevent Armageddon. And in the actual Cold War, Armageddon never showed up. What showed up instead was Vietnam, the Aegean, a civilian airliner over the Pacific, a spy plane over Sverdlovsk. And in every one of those scenarios, these machines were completely, painfully out of their element. Let's start with the Americans. The 509th Fighter Interceptor Squadron deployed the F-102 to Southeast Asia with what I can only describe as a spectacular failure of imagination. There were no Soviet bombers to intercept over the Vietnamese jungle. So, and I want you to really think about this decision, the Air Force started using their Mach 1.2 supersonic interceptors as low-altitude night attack aircraft over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The infrared sensor system, designed to detect 295 engine heat at 50,000 feet, was now being used to spot the thermal signature of North Vietnamese truck engines. And campfires. These aircraft were hunting campfires. A declassified Aviation Week report actually tried to frame this positively. 106 structures and 16 boats destroyed in 45 days of operations. I read that number and my first thought was, what does it cost to fire an AIM-4 Falcon against a wooden boat? But the real price was paid differently. 14 F-102s were lost in Vietnam. And the one that bothers me most is February 3rd, 1968. A pair of F-102s was bounced by a single MiG-21. The North Vietnamese pilot Lieutenant Pham Thanh Nguyen slid into the blind spot behind the trailing Delta Dagger and fired one R-3's Atoll missile. One shot, F-102 serial number 561166, Lieutenant Wallace Wiggins, dead. The aircraft designed to kill Soviet nuclear bombers got ambushed and killed by a much smaller, much more agile fighter. That's not a failure of courage, that's a failure of doctrine. You built a sprinter and tried to make it wrestle. Then July 1974, the Aegean. And this one carries a particular kind of absurdity because both aircraft involved were NATO allies. Turkish F-102s versus Greek F-5 freedom fighters. Two countries that shared the same alliance flew American aircraft, and then turned those aircraft on each other during the Cyprus crisis. The F-5 is a light, nimble, pure dogfighter. The F-102 is twice its weight, has more thrust, and in a turning fight is nearly helpless. Here's the physics. When a delta wing aircraft gets forced into a slow, tight turning battle, that huge wing area becomes a liability. High angle of attack creates enormous induced drag. The aircraft bleeds energy. Airspeed collapses. You go from supersonic interceptor to a struggling, slow-moving target in seconds, and at slow speeds. With high G-forces, the AIM-4 missiles simply couldn't function properly. At least one F-102 was destroyed. Possibly more. The exact numbers remain disputed, buried in Greek and Turkish military archives. But the lesson is absolutely clear. The doctrine of no guns, missiles only in a real, messy, unscripted combat environment, was a catastrophic failure. If the Americans suffered from overconfidence in their technology, the Soviets suffered from a different disease. Rigidity, blind obedience to the chain of command, and technological gaps that their pilots couldn't overcome. No matter how brave they were. May 1st, 1960. France's Gary Powers flies a CIA U-2 reconnaissance aircraft deep into Soviet airspace at over 65,000 feet. The Su-9 assigned to intercept it had just come off the production line. It had no missiles loaded. It was being ferried to a new base. The GCI ground controller came on the radio with an order that I still find chilling. Destroy the target by any means necessary, with no weapons, to a pilot in a brand new aircraft. At 65,000 feet, that order meant one thing: ramming, fly into the U-2, take them both down. Accept death. Captain Igor Menchukov acknowledged the order. He asked only that the government look after his family. Sit with that for a moment. A man calmly accepting a death sentence because a radar controller on the ground told him to. That's not bravery, that's a system that had completely dissolved the boundary between a human being and a guided missile. As it turned out, the speed differential and poor ground control coordination prevented the intercept. A surface-to-air SAR-2 missile ultimately downed Powers. But the order tells you everything you need to know about how the Soviet system valued its pilots. The Su-15's greatest weakness wasn't its radar or its missiles. It was the doctrine that governed it. Total dependence on ground controllers who were working with imperfect information and absolutely no hesitation to pull the trigger. That weakness had two consequences that shook the world. September 1st, 1978. Korean Airlines Flight 902 strays off course and enters Soviet airspace, and Su-15 intercepts it. 2 passengers are killed when the aircraft is disabled. The Soviets claim it was a spy plane. Here's something I find both hilarious and genuinely tragic about the 1950s military mindset. Smart people serious. Experienced military thinkers at the Pentagon and in the Kremlin looked at supersonic aircraft and decided something truly confident. Dogfighting is dead, cannons are obsolete, the future is missiles. And so, with breathtaking certainty, both superpowers stripped the guns off their interceptors and bet everything on first-generation air-to-air missiles. The F-106 carried the AIM-4 Falcon. The Su-15 carried the R-98 Anab. Same philosophy, very, very different execution. Let me tell you about the AIM-4 Falcon, because honestly, the more I read about this weapon, the more I question the entire decision-making chain that put it on a frontline aircraft. The warhead. 2.75 pounds of explosive. That's it. Roughly 1 kilogram. The Navy's AIM-9 Sidewinder, which the Air Force refused to use, carried 12.5 pounds. No proximity fuse. The AIM-4 had to directly hit the target aircraft to detonate. Not near it. Not within a few feet. A direct physical impact against a maneuvering aircraft at supersonic closing speeds. But wait, it gets worse. The infrared seeker head required 16 seconds of nitrogen cooling before it could lock onto a target. 16 seconds is an eternity in a supersonic intercept, and once you activated that cooling cycle, you had exactly 2 minutes to use the missile. After 2 minutes, the nitrogen is spent. The seeker goes blind. You can't recool it. That missile is now dead weight. Picture yourself in that cockpit. Mach 2, adrenaline spiking. The Mach 1 computer finally gets a lock. You trigger the cooling cycle 16, 15, 14, and then your target banks into a cloud layer. The AIM-4's infrared seeker can't track through clouds. Your too minute window closes. You just turned a sophisticated guided missile into an expensive paperweight. So why did the Air Force keep this weapon? Here's the uncomfortable answer: the not invented here syndrome. The Air Force had their weapon. The Navy had theirs. And in the culture of the 1950s American military-industrial complex, using the other branch's superior product was simply not acceptable. That arrogance, by the way, would be paid for in blood over Vietnam. Now the Air Force knew the AIM-4 was marginal, and their workaround to compensate for an inadequate missile is, I think, the single most unhinged tactical decision of the Cold War: the Air-2 Genie. An unguided rocket with a 1.5 kiloton nuclear warhead. No guidance system needed. You don't have to aim precisely. You fly your F-106 into the formation of Soviet bombers, fire the Genie, and the nuclear detonation radius destroys everything within several kilometers. Every 295 in the formation gone. Problem solved. The fact that this detonation might occur over Canada, over American soil, over friendly territory. That detail apparently did not disqualify the concept. Think about what that tells you. The Americans were so convinced their precision missiles wouldn't work, they built a nuclear alternative. Over their own country, the Soviets had a different philosophy, and I genuinely respect the brutal logic of it. Even if I'd never want to be on the receiving end. The R-98 Anab, 40-kilogram warhead. That's 30 times the explosive mass of the AIM-4. The Soviets weren't trying to thread a needle. They were swinging an axe. Standard GCI doctrine was to fire in a specific sequence. Infrared seeker first. Radar seeker within 1 second. The reason? If you fire radar first, the heat signature from its exhaust blinds the missile behind it. Fire first, radar second. Now you have two completely independent guidance systems chasing the same target. The bomber uses electronic countermeasures to jam the radar seeker. The missile keeps coming, locked onto engine heat. The bomber uses flares to fool the seeker. The radar missile keeps tracking. You have to defeat both systems simultaneously. It's unsophisticated, it's heavy, it creates massive drag on the Su-15, and it works. Here's the uncomfortable conclusion I keep coming back to when I compare these two arsenals. Sophistication is only valuable when it functions. The Americans built the more elegant weapon, and it was borderline useless in combat conditions. The Soviets built the blunt instrument, and their missiles killed things. But both sides paid for the same original sin: removing the gun. Eventually, reality forced both superpowers to admit the mistake. The F-106 had a 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon jammed into its weapons bay, a retrofit, not a design choice. The Su-15 got twin-barrel UPC-23 250 cannon pods strapped to its belly, the most advanced interceptors in the world. Had to be retrofitted with technology from World War II. I sometimes think about the engineers who signed off on removing those guns in the first place. I wonder if any of them had the self-awareness to feel embarrassed about it. Perfection, it turns out, has an expiration date. The F-106 and the Su-15 reached the absolute peak of what a dedicated interceptor could be: Delta Wing. Mach 2+, optimized for one mission, stopped the bombers, saved the cities, and then the world changed. And the bombers weren't the threat anymore. Here's what I keep coming back to whenever I think about these aircraft. The F-106 Delta Dart cost $5 million in 1960s money. Its entire reason for existing was to reach altitude fast enough to fire missiles, or if necessary, a nuclear rocket over friendly soil. The Su-15 pilot was expected to follow ground controller commands without question, to the point where one pilot was ordered to ram a target with an unarmed aircraft. Both systems demanded total sacrifice, and neither system ever had to deliver on that demand against an actual incoming nuclear bomber. That's not failure. That's deterrence working. Standing in front of the Cornfield Bomber, looking at that sleek Delta Wing and those clean lines, I don't see a relic. I see the physical embodiment of a specific moment in history when human beings were so terrified of destroying each other that they poured their greatest engineering minds into building machines designed to prevent it. The fact that Armageddon never arrived, the fact that those weapons bays never had to open in anger, the fact that Gary Faust's ejection seat is now a museum exhibit rather than wreckage from a nuclear exchange over Canadian airspace. That's not failure. That might be the greatest success story in the history of air power. The Cold War's dedicated interceptors, every single one of them died without ever fulfilling their purpose. And I genuinely believe that's the best possible outcome anyone could have hoped for.